Welcome back to Connect and Transform. In this video, I'm just hypothesizing about a possible future project that I know absolutely nothing about, which is I want to build a text comparison tool similar to what you see on the screen, except one that allows you, similar to some other comparison tools, allows you to select and then just hit a button and push those from one side to the other. So again, I know nothing about building any such thing. So there are probably fancier algorithms that I'm about to speak to. But here are my thoughts after thinking about it for 2 or 3 minutes. So the basic algorithm would be check 2 lines. So that would be, line 1 on this side and line 1 on this side, and then compare them, and if they're the same, write them to the screen and then advance forward. And keep doing that until they don't match. Okay, so that is potentially going to get us all these white regions, but now we need to modify the approach to be able to detect regions that only exist on one side or the other. So let's say we get up to this line here, which on the other side would be this line here. One thing I want to note real quick is that this closing style tag on the right-hand side is actually line 10 of that file. It's not line 14. And I also want to note that if we scroll down a bit, there's a region here that doesn't actually exist in the file, so it doesn't have real line numbers. So I just want to point out that the line numbers shown on both sides have absolutely nothing to do with the line numbers in the file, at least not necessarily. So we're going to have at least 2 cursors, one on each side, to keep track of which lines we've actually processed. Now, as soon as we meet 2 lines, like the 2 that are selected that don't match, now I think we're going to need 2 additional cursors, one per side. So we're going to need some kind of look-ahead cursor. So, for example, on the left-hand side, its look-ahead cursor would advance and compare its value to the processing cursor on the right-hand side. And essentially, simultaneously, on the right-hand side, we advance one to this defs tag, and that look-ahead cursor on the defs tag would compare to the value of the processing cursor on the left-hand side. And so you'd keep advancing the look-ahead cursor on both sides, comparing each value to the opposite file's processing cursor until you either reach the end of the file or you find a match. So in this case, we advance, and then all of a sudden we find a match. So on the left-hand side, this is the look-ahead cursor. On the right-hand side, this is the processing cursor. They match, right? And so now we've identified this red region here that only exists in this file. And so I think using logic somewhat like I've tried to describe, we should be able to detect red regions, and we should be able to apply the logic to either side, either file. So I think really the difficulty will be the regions highlighted in yellow, although I'm noticing that like this region here, which is noted as lines 85 through 89, although that's not the line numbers of the file, those particular lines in yellow only differ by white space. That should be pretty easy to detect, I would think, but I'll have to think about that, because now we're not only dealing with potentially 4 cursors, but we're also dealing with 2 different ways of interpreting the data, one being completely and literally, the second being after we've stripped out white space. So I'll have to think about how, quote, easy that would be. Might have to go back and do like a second processing loop. But let's look at another yellow line. So like this line here. Now, because this is an ID, we know that these 2 instances of data don't exist anywhere in the other file, at least not in the exact form. So if imagine that we had our processing cursors on these two highlighted lines. Our look ahead cursors would keep looking ahead. They'd reach the end of one file, reach the end of the other file, and then we would know that they're different. So I think for phase one, I wouldn't be smart enough to detect these as being the same line. I wouldn't have them in yellow or whatever other color. I think I would have uh, two red lines. So I would have a red line here on the left-hand side, and then right across from it would be gray. And then imagine there was another line. Then over here, this one would be red and it would be gray on the other side. So you'd still identify the mismatch. You just wouldn't quite identify that those two mismatched lines could really be the same line. Now, maybe in a future phase, I would look at the start or the end of the line or something like that, or identify the specific tokens or individual characters and see how much they match each other, and then maybe I'd be able to use that to try and identify if the two can be merged into the same line. But I think that'll be a complicated one for a future date. Another thing I want to point out is here, which is what they show as line 76. They have red on one side, green on the other. As I've described my thought process, this would never occur. And actually, I think it's proper that it doesn't occur. I think it's more proper to show a red line with gray on the opposite file. So one going one direction, the other going the other direction, and taking an extra line, especially in this case, because the content of this line has nothing to do with the content of this line. They're clearly different. So in my opinion, the text compare tool failed here, and I could probably do it better. But as I've described it, I think just about everything else I could do well. Now, in particular, when I'm looking at like this long line here, there's obviously some very long substrings that are a perfect match, although the total line is not a perfect match. So I would imagine that without too much effort in a future phase, I could probably handle like that yellow line and this yellow line here. And of course, the coloring green versus red is just left versus right. You could swap one for the other. It doesn't really matter. So other than some of the yellow lines, I think that the basic approach that I've outlined would be sufficient to largely duplicate what we see here. I think my goal for the project is to take these two specific files and to try and match them at least as well and perhaps better. I have no idea how long it's going to take or if I will even accomplish that, but that's the goal. I'm going to think about it while I'm dreaming tonight. Thanks for listening.